This is Glenn Greenwald, and I wanted to do a subscriber-only video to talk about probably the most talked about political, cultural, and financial event of certainly today and probably the last couple of weeks, one that is extremely complex if you haven't taken many hours to look into it and to read about it and understand it, but also one that is fascinating and I think highly consequential. And so I wanted to do a video in part just to lay out, as I understand it, what has happened, and then discuss some of my observations about the implications of it and the reason why I think it's so important. So there's obviously a lot of complexities involved when you're talking about anything concerning Wall Street and the way that money is made or lost on Wall Street. And you essentially either have to work on Wall Street or be very involved to understand all of the detailed complexities. But it's really not necessary to dig that deep into the details here to understand the broad strokes of what happened and especially to understand the implications. So in general, when you invest in companies through Wall Street, when you buy in the stock market, the standard way that you buy is you pick a company that you think is a healthy company that will improve in the future, and you hope that you buy at a price that's relatively low and that price will increase as the performance of the company does. So you buy a stock at $30, within 6 months it goes up to $50, and you've now made a profit, which is the difference between $30 and $50 per share. You sell your shares for $50 that you bought for $30, and that is your profit. And that is the standard way that especially small investors invest in the stock market. But there's another way that profit is made on the stock market, particularly by large institutional investors, hedge funds, highly sophisticated investors who do it for a living, which is called short selling. And it essentially is exactly the opposite of the profit model I just described. When you're short selling, you're not looking for companies that you think are doing well and whose stock price will increase. You're looking for companies that you think are doing poorly and whose stock price will therefore decrease. And instead of buying that stock and then waiting for that price to decrease, which obviously would result in a loss of money, what they do instead is they short sell. And the mechanics of how this bet is made, they're simply betting that the price will go down by a certain date, which will be their profit, is they, instead of buying the stock, they simply borrow the stock so that they hold it in their hand. They've essentially sold it that way, and they or essentially have bought it that way, and they are betting that the stock price will go down in the future, and then they are required at that point, at some date in the future, on or before that date, to buy those shares that they've now borrowed. And the hope when you do that is that when you get those shares, what you're essentially buying the shares at, or selling the shares rather, you're selling high, so you do it at the stock is 20 and you think it's going to go down to 5. So you essentially sell at 20 by getting those shares. And then when the stock goes down to 5, then you buy it. So you've now bought these shares for $5 that you've essentially previously sold at 20. It might sound confusing, but the essence of it is that what you're really doing is betting that instead of the stock price going up, the stock price is going down. So you're short selling it. You only make money if the stock actually goes down. Now, one of the really important things to note about the difference between the standard way of investing in the stock market and short selling is that if you invest the standard way, the way that I described, you're limited in how much you can lose by however much you invest. So if I buy 100 shares of a company that's trading at $5, I bought $500 worth of stock. Even if that company goes bankrupt, goes to zero, I've simply lost my original investment, $500. I can't lose any more than $500, the amount that I purchase the stock for. But when you short sell, there's really no limit on how much you can lose. You're borrowing the stock and you're promising to buy it at a certain date in the future. So if that stock goes from 20 to 40, you've lost a lot of money. But if it goes from 20 to 400, you've lost 10 times as much money. You've lost an enormous amount of money. And then, of course, if it goes from 20 to 600, you've lost even more. So there's no limit on what your downside might be. Now, this short selling is exactly what has been exploited and targeted in the controversy that you probably have heard about involving the publicly traded company Gamestop and the investors at Reddit who have essentially single-handedly sabotaged at least one major hedge fund on Wall Street. And the way they've done that is by exploiting this extraordinary vulnerability that if you short sell a stock and that stock then goes up in price, you've lost money. If it goes up dramatically, you can lose, even if you're a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, close to all of your assets. If it keeps going up, you can essentially lose everything. Now, one of the things that happened was that there was this GameStop stock that is a company that has really been struggling. It's kind of an anemic company. It has stores that sell video games in shopping malls. Even before the pandemic, it was struggling. And with the pandemic, with nobody going into shopping malls, with people buying video games increasingly online, it has become a company that seems doomed. And throughout the end of 2020, it was trading at a very anemic stock price of between $4 and $5. And then in the last couple of days in 2020 and into the first week or two of 2021, it began to kind of have an uptick to $10 and then to $20, where it kind of stabilized for the last couple of weeks. But then something that few people have ever seen before, this stock exploded. It went from 20 to 40. And then 2 days ago on Monday, it went from 40 and it closed at 147. 147, so it almost increased from 20 to 40 and then 40 to 147 by 4 times in one day. And today it closed at $347. $347. At a month ago, it was trading at $5 a share. It's now at $347. Even though nothing about the company has changed, it's not doing any better. It hasn't shown any signs of improving or coming back to life. All of the fundamentals that caused it to go down in the first place are still just as grim. So how is it that a stock could go from $5 to $20 to $20 to $147 to $147 to $347 with no apparent rationale connected to the performance of the company? And the answer lies in this subreddit thread, this subreddit group that is a subreddit called Wall Street Bets. And people on this subreddit perceived, understood, observed that several of the country's most powerful and wealthiest hedge funds have extremely large short sell positions in several different companies, particularly GameStop. These hedge fund companies saw GameStop go from $4 to $5 to $10, believed that the company was going to go out of business, and so placed enormous bets on the fact that the stock price would drop. Probably they were hoping that it would go bankrupt. They probably intended to do things to foster its bankruptcy, and then they would then profit on the ashes of this company, which is what short sellers often do. They use their platform to talk the company down. They get people to dump the stock to make them think that the company is going bankrupt, even sometimes if it's not really going bankrupt, and sometimes it really is. And then they swoop in and they sweep up often hundreds of billions of dollars off the backs of companies that they've helped destroy or that just destroyed on their own. So they create really nothing of value. Sometimes they expose overvalued shares or even fraud, but by and large, they're not, even if whatever you think of Silicon Valley, they're making their money because they're at least creating something. Short sellers are just gambling like in a casino, and often corruptly gambling because they're manipulating the market to have to reach the result that they want. Now, these Redditors, who are for the most part, small individual investors, but there's huge numbers of people. It's a very popular subreddit, and it's also politically tinged. Realized that one hedge firm in particular, Melvin Capital, one of the best performing, wealthiest, most important, influential, and powerful hedge funds in Wall Street, was deeply invested in a short sell position in GameStop. And they also realized that if the price of GameStop would go up, Melvin Capital would suffer great financial loss. And if it really went up to an enormous number, you could actually bankrupt, destroy an entire hedge fund with billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of assets, institutional investors, including pensions. So it's not as though it's all something to cackle at, but the people who run the hedge fund are unimaginably rich. They're at the top of the food chain when it comes to Wall Street. Hedge fund managers are. They're the most credentialed, the most respected. They have the most power and often the most wealth. That's where real Wall Street wealth and power resides. And so these Redditors knew that if they just banded together and started buying and buying and buying and buying the stock of GameStop, it would drive the price up, and it would not only inflict great harm on this hedge fund that had bet its life essentially that this price would go down, but they would make enormous amounts of money as well by driving the price up, by buying low at $5, at $20, and now it's up to $347. So imagine how much money many of them have made buying at such a low price, only for it to have gone up to an extraordinary price. Now, it's hard to overstate the damage it did to Melvin Capital. Melvin Capital yesterday had to borrow a bailout of $2.5 billion from other hedge funds, and the stock price increase of today unquestionably wiped out enormous other of their assets. They claim that they got out finally and salvaged 15% of their overall assets, which means that they lost hundreds of billions of dollars. There's a real question, though, whether they really got out or whether they want people to believe that they got out to undermine the incentive to continue to buy and hope the price goes back down and they can minimize their losses. But no matter what happened, it inflicted great pain on them. And no matter what happened, a lot of these individual investors on the subreddit profited greatly. So that's the basics. If they perceived that Melvin Capital had a huge short selling stake position in GameStop, and they knew that if they drove the price up, it would erode most of the assets, if not destroy the asset base of Melvin Capital and other hedge funds who were similarly positioned. And they knew that by playing the game that these hedge fund managers typically play, which is manipulating the market for their own benefit, they could also enrich themselves. Now, in manipulating the market to the enrichment of the people doing it is what Wall Street does every day. It's what hedge funds do all the time. The only thing that is different in this case is that instead of hedge fund billionaires making billions of dollars and getting rich off market manipulation, it's a bunch of anonymous Reddit trolls who have banded together to do it. Now, I just want to make a couple of observations because I don't want to feign clarity or certainty about things that either I don't have certainty about or clarity about, or that I don't think anybody has certainty or clarity about. For one thing, it's really not clear how much of this David versus Goliath story that these individual anonymous poor Redditors banded together and enriched themselves at the expense of this big bad hedge fund is really true. So much money is necessary to drive a stock price up to the point that it is gone. So much buying of that stock is needed that there's a lot of speculation, we don't really know yet, that a major player in all of this are other hedge funds or other Wall Street players who saw the same opportunity that these Redditors saw once it began going and are driving a lot of the buying. So in other words, they're enriching themselves off of the death of this other hedge fund. There's also a kind of warring pair of factions, which is Silicon Valley versus Wall Street. You see a lot of leaders of Silicon Valley, including Elon Musk and others, cheering the Redditors, in part because there's just a cultural competition between Wall Street and Silicon Valley. They really hate each other in a lot of ways. In part because a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs hate short sellers because short sellers have attacked their companies as well, including Tesla, which is Elon Musk's company. And so he has hated short sellers and has been at war with them for a long time. They believe, probably correctly, that Tesla's stock price is wildly inflated in terms of what it actually is worth, but he's insisted that's not true and has delighted in the fact that the stock price just keeps going up, harming Tesla short sellers who are trying to harm the company because it's in their interest to bring the price down. So it's not as though there are no centers of financial and political power on the side of these Redditors. You see these Silicon Valley tycoons cheering them on, advocating for them, clearly kind of wallowing and at least shouting for it, if not direct benefit themselves. There have been a couple who have very publicly bought GameStop in order to help this campaign and then donated, a couple of them did, their profits to various charities, including the Barstool one designed to help small businesses. But clearly, there are a lot of rich investors, a lot of probably big Wall Street people, even institutional investors who have profited along the way. And what the ratio is between small Redditors and these bigger actors is unclear. But nonetheless, there is no question that it germinated in Reddit, in this subthread, that at least some of these people have become wealthy, whereas 2 weeks ago they were probably struggling or poor. And it really is, if you think about it just in those terms, a massive transfer of wealth from hedge fund managers, just billions of dollars transferred to Reddit users. And that's why it has caused so much fascination, because it's like a very effective populist uprising against these hedge funds. And it's also causing an extreme amount of concern and worry for the same reason on the part of Wall Street, their media allies, people saying this needs to be stopped right away. We can't have this. Essentially, as several leftist commentators and right-wing commentators have said, the reaction seems to be, oh, wait, the wrong people are manipulating Wall Street for their own interests. So that's essentially the core of it, is that this short sell position on the part of Melvin Capital and other hedge funds in GameStop has been exploited by people on Reddit and then others because they've driven the stock price up, which is exactly what you do not want if you're heavily invested in a company from a short sell position. You can be destroyed, and that's what happened to at least one of these hedge funds. It has also enriched a lot of people who bought at $20 or even $30 or $40 or $100, and the stock is now at $350 with no sign of it going down because they're vowing to hold on to the stock and even drive it up to $1,000 a share. That's the vow on Reddit. We'll see if that happens or not. Now, I want to talk about a couple of really interesting, not financial implications, but political and cultural implications. The reason why I'm so riveted by this story. Number one is it is a reminder of how damaging Wall Street has been to the ordinary American, not to the left or the right, or even to a particular region of just to the ordinary American. The 2008 financial crisis was so traumatic, so cataclysmic, so devastating that we're not even close to being recovered from it, and likely will never be. It has wiped out the financial security of at least one generation, probably two generations of Americans, people who are completely buried in college debt or postgraduate debt, or without any job prospects, whether they don't go to college or whether they do. In the United States, even before the pandemic, the number of Americans living with their parents up to the age of 30 is greater than at any time since the Great Depression. The idea of a middle-class dream of being able to start a family, of buying a house, of having a wife or husband and kids in your 20s is basically gone for everyone except those born into very rich families. And even going into your mid-30s, it becomes increasingly difficult. And so the population is angry, and they know that Wall Street has played a major role in it. Now, the interesting thing about this subreddit is that even though it is named after Wall Street Bets, and it's devoted to talking about Wall Street and stocks and the stock market, it has a strong political identity. It's probably a little bit difficult to pin down, which is what makes it interesting. It's probably, I guess, if you had to pick, you would say it's more associated with this kind of alt-right or new right ethos, although not really sure that's true. I think it really more comes out of a ethos, a political and cultural tradition of 4chan. And in fact, the motto that's often used in media accounts and even, I believe, by subredditors themselves to describe what this subreddit is 4chan meets a Bloomberg terminal, meaning you take the political and cultural vibe of 4chan and you put it focused on the stock market, and that's what this subreddit is. So it clearly is politically tinged. It also has a strong gamer component. They like video games. They talk about video games. It's an important part of their identity. And so the fact that they were able to inflict so much suffering and pain and angst and anxiety on Wall Street by embracing and buying and inflating the price of a video game store that many of them in adolescence loved because that's where they went to the mall to buy their video games has just made it all the more poignant, this whole narrative. So clearly, though, and if you read the comments, especially the top comments and the top commenters and the entire thrust of the subreddit, which I've been doing for a few days now, that clearly is driven, I would say, principally by disgust and anger towards the people in Wall Street who enrich themselves on the backs of everybody else without contributing anything of value, who manipulate the market by using their position to drive down the companies in which they've invested from a short sell perspective, or talk up companies using their media platforms in which they've invested in a standard way in order to drive the stock price up. They feel the whole financial system is rigged. They think the people who are rigging it and exploiting it are morally repugnant and they deserve to suffer. And it is hard to develop a lot of sympathy for these extremely wealthy hedge fund managers who are now trying to play the victim. So I think that it's a reminder because 2008 now is 12 years ago, and a lot has happened since. 2 terms of an Obama administration, 1 term of a Trump administration, and now we're into a Biden administration, that it's easy to forget how traumatizing that event was. But it has destroyed the economic future of tens of millions of people in the United States alone, to say nothing of throughout the democratic world. So much right-wing populism in Western Europe, Brexit in the UK, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the United States, very much is directly connected to, if not the primary byproduct of, the 2008 financial crisis and the role that Wall Street played. And what we have to remember is it wasn't just that Wall Street caused it. It's that the government, when it went to respond to that crisis with people buried in mortgages that they couldn't pay, with dropping, collapsing values in their homes, underwater mortgages, people who were evicted from their homes because they couldn't pay their mortgages en masse, the government acted almost entirely indifferently to the vast majority of the population that was suffering, and acted instead to bail out the richest people in the country, the ones who caused the financial crisis in the first place. And everybody saw that it wasn't just that the stock market is a casino, it's a totally rigged casino where if you're the richest people, you can keep placing bets, and if you win, all the money goes to you. And then if you lose enough, the government steps in and takes money from the taxpayer and gives it to you to shield you from your own losses, so you basically can't lose. That was the phrase, was too big to fail. They're too important, they're too rich, they're too big, they're too central to the economy to ever allow to fail. So they get to just keep gambling and getting richer when they win, and then never having any consequences when they lose, because the government that they own through their lobbyist activity steps in and helps them out first and helps out nobody else. That's what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. What happened since, and so much of the anger that is driving this populist uprising, this democratization of finance, is driven by that sentiment. And all you have to do to know that is just spend some time reading the subreddit. It really is driven by populist rage toward Wall Street. Now, that's the other point I want to make, is what fascinates me about this is the political component to it. Because if you think about anger toward Wall Street, and particularly anger about the way in which Wall Street manipulates markets for its own ends to enrich a tiny number of people at the expense of everybody else, is that anger toward Wall Street a left-wing view, or is it a right-wing view? I would say it's both and neither a left-wing or a right-wing view. It really isn't definable that way. It's one of the few issues, although I think there are a lot more than most people believe there are, but that's certainly one that isn't really divisible by left and right. And you've seen a lot of prominent right-wing people in media and politics today cheer on what happened with Reddit and GameStop and Melvin Capital, including people like Sagar and Jetty and other right-wing magazines. And then just about an hour ago, before I began talking here, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came onto Twitter and essentially said something very similar to what right-wing commentators have said, which is, oh, we're supposed to feel sorry for Wall Street that gets rich off everybody else's back, and then the one time they lose, they complain that the system is unfair and rigged, when this is what they do to everybody all the time. You hear exactly the same thing from the right and from the left. And I think that one of the things that has gotten overlooked is there was really interesting politics surrounding that 2008 bailout. A lot of people forget that that bailout, which happened in the end of 2008, the end of George W. Bush's second term after Obama was already elected, or as he was about to be elected, the bailout was presented as this emergency measure, and it got the support of the leaders, the establishment leaders of the establishment wings of both parties, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi in the House, Paul Ryan in the House. Everybody from the establishment wings of both parties was behind it. And yet the first time this bailout was put up for a vote, even though we were being told that the whole financial system would collapse if it didn't get passed and quickly, it failed. It was rejected by the House in 2008 by an extremely bipartisan vote. I believe it was something like 133 Republicans and 96 Democrats voted against, so almost equal. And when it was rejected, the market plummeted severely in response to what they hoped was going to be this massive infusion, trillions of dollars of a bailout, only to see on a bipartisan basis the populist wings of both parties. It was really the right wing and the left wing that joined together to reject it against the establishment. They did everything they had to do. They gave promises. They did trades. They made favors to get the votes that they needed. And the second time that they finally passed it, it narrowly passed. And this time 108 Republicans voted no. So they got about 15 Republicans to change their vote, and 63 Democrats voted no. So they got 30 Democrats to switch their vote and vote yes, and they got the bailout passed. But still, there was extreme anger on both the right and the left over the bailout. And a lot of people forget that the Occupy Wall Street movement that began and really did have a big impact was primarily driven in the beginning by anger over the Wall Street bailout. That's why it was called Occupy Wall Street. But the Tea Party protests, and I went to several of them, although it was originally instigated by this very kind of Reagan-esque rant by Rick Santelli on CNBC about the unfairness of high taxation, a kind of very standard Republican economic orthodoxy that Donald Trump ran against in 2016, if you went to those early Tea Party protests, they weren't in defense of Wall Street and in defense of the right of Wall Street to profit without paying taxes. It was very much similar to the Occupy Wall Street. They were Ron Paul libertarians, kind of what I would describe as now modern day Tulsi Gabbard supporters, people who aren't really definable by a political party, certainly, or even a political ideology. They're more independent. And they were just as angry about the Wall Street bailout as Occupy Wall Street and the leftists who drove that. That was before that Tea Party got astroturfed into a Chamber of Commerce Republican Party arm. And this is what I think is so fascinating about these politics and this question is if you're one of the things that has always determined whether you're on the right or whether you're on the left are debates over economic policy and the best economic system. And if you're on the left, your view of free market capitalism, free market economics, is that you're against it. You want government intervention on behalf of those who are neediest, to help people who are poor, to give better services to those who are low-income earners. That's a left-wing economic policy. Or even if you go a little bit further on the left-wing spectrum, you want socialism so that you distribute wealth to the people who most need it. Whereas people on the right, the defining economic orthodoxy has always been, no, I believe in free market capitalism, free market economics. Keep the government out of the free market. Just have laissez-faire economics and let the winners win because they deserve it. It's a meritocracy. They create, they sell, they deserve to get what they want, and let the losers essentially lose. Yeah, we'll provide a safety net. Some say, others say no safety net at all, because the higher taxes you have to pay for that safety net, the more it hurts the market. Okay, that's the standard debate between right and left. Pro-free market economics, anti-free market economics. What we have now, and have had for decades, certainly since the 2008 financial crisis, but even before that, is neither. We do not have free market economics where the government stays out of the economy. That's the reason that banks and corporations pay enormous sums of money to former officials who then become lobbyists who open doors in Washington so that they can influence and access government, because government is constantly interfering in the free market, constantly interfering in the economy. And the richest people, the most powerful people, pay lobbyists on K Street, or just pay former officials like Janet Yellen, who they knew was likely to go back into office, or people like Hillary Clinton. They just pay them and enrich them with millions of dollars when they're not in government, so that once they do go in government, they'll be positively disposed to use state power on their behalf, which is exactly what they do. The government constantly intervenes in the economy. It is not free market economics. It is not capitalism. It is crony capitalism at best. Now, if you're on the left, you don't mind government intervention in the economy. In fact, you want it, but you want it in order to benefit the neediest. That is certainly not what's happening. The government does intervene in the economy, but they intervene only to benefit those who are richest, to benefit Facebook and Google and Amazon and Wall Street banks. So there is no left-wing economics of socialism or government intervention on behalf of the poorest, and there's no right-wing interventionism or right-wing economics in terms of non-interventionism or free market economics. You have the government constantly intervening in the market, but on the side of the rich. So if you're poor, if you're on the left rather, or if you're on the right, you have to hate equally what's going on. This is not either socialism or free market economics. It's kleptocracy. It's oligarchy. And I think that this is, one of the things that I often try to do so much is look for ways that people on the left and people on the right can find common purpose despite very sharp differences in other ways, because that's the only way that majorities are going to be formed to challenge ruling class power. It's exactly what just happened over the last 48 hours. To the extent that you think what just happened is a positive, constructive, beneficial uprising, as I do, it is not a left-wing or a right-wing view. If you think that, there are people on the left and people on the right almost unanimously who believe the same thing and who are reacting to it the same way because they're equally disgusted by this corrupted power center that's called Wall Street, and there's been no way to challenge them until today. This is one of the first times that we've seen genuine pain inflicted on them, not by their fellow titans and masters of the universe, but by a bunch of small people uniting together. Now, again, that picture is not as clear about how true that David versus Goliath narrative is, but it's certainly a big part of what happened, even if there are lots of other things going on, which certainly there are. And I think there needs to be all kinds of investigations to determine whether other hedge funds like Citadel are benefiting in this breach by being on both sides of the market, selling and buying and manipulating the market to their own benefit. I don't know if they are. I think they should be investigated. I think this whole thing needs to be investigated, because when hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth is suddenly transferred in a very short period of time, we need to know what happened and why. But one thing that cannot happen, but which very well might, is that the government intervenes to protect these hedge funds simply because this time they lost under the rules that they themselves implemented and have been playing under and winning for many, many years. You cannot have a system of rules where any faction can only win but never lose. If you're going to change the system, you have to change it for everybody. And if you're not going to change it, then you have to let these hedge fund managers suffer the losses that they have suffered. They made a huge, huge bet, and had they succeeded like they usually do, they would have been enriched wildly, but they didn't. They lost because they bet that the price is going to go down, but huge numbers of other people decided they wanted to buy that stock. So they made a terrible bet. They suffered greatly financially because of that loss, and you have to let them suffer the consequences of that loss, which is exactly what did not happen in 2008. And I think this is why this is so important, is you're now already seeing calls from political officials beholden to hedge fund managers on Wall Street, CNBC commentators who are spokespeople for the financial industry, just like NBC News and CNN are spokespeople for the intelligence community, and hedge fund managers themselves kicking and screaming, "This is unfair. We've been victimized by market manipulation. We demand that the government intervene." You already see major banks barring individual investors from buying these stocks, just arbitrarily cutting them off. The stock market itself is suggesting that it might just permanently suspend trading, at least until these institutional investors can discover their, quote, equilibrium. They're talking about potential legislative reforms. I could easily see the Congress acting so quickly to protect these hedge fund managers that we get reform to protect them before we even get a relief package that was promised when the Democrats won Georgia for more direct payments to people because of the COVID pandemic. That is the political system that is being exposed. These are the power dynamics being revealed. And this has become an important way, not just to understand it, but to combat it. And that's why it's causing so much excitement and so much anger in different sectors, because it is so rare to watch these oligarchs and these Wall Street tycoons be destroyed by their own game. And that's exactly what has happened, and whoever is responsible for that, we ought to know. But certainly there is a lot to cheer in what it is we're seeing, not just financially, but politically and culturally as well. So I hope this has been helpful to illuminate all this. I've spent a couple of days talking to people who have worked in Wall Street forever, learning as much as I can about exactly what it is that happened. I didn't want to write about it because I don't yet have enough of a grip on exactly what I want to say in a nice package, but I wanted to just kind of discuss with you my observations and my reactions and the things that I'm seeing and why I think this is so important up until now. So I hope this video has been helpful in illuminating what I know are these complicated events. Thanks very much.